Case are following now a man accused of raping a teenager over 2 years ago. This morning, Rico Johnson came face to face with the teen. Fox 13's Gloria Gomez shows us how his questions may have backfired, though, with the jury.
Rico Johnson walked up to the podium holding a sheet of paper, ready to mount his own defense.
My name is Rico Johnson. How y'all doing? Good morning.
First, he apologized.
I'm sorry for the inconvenience of the situation.
Then, in a rambling opening statement, told them he didn't do it.
There are courtrooms where justice moves quietly, orderly, procedural, predictable. And then there are courtrooms where something happens that makes everyone stop breathing. This was one of those rooms. Picture a teenage girl, just 15 years old, seated at the witness stand, her voice steady but fragile, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. Across the room sits the man accused of violating her trust, her safety, and her childhood. But here's where this case takes a turn that few people were prepared for. That man wasn't represented by a lawyer. He stood up and chose to question her himself. For nearly 1 full hour, the accused, Rico Johnson, cross-examined the very teenager who said he assaulted her. Not through an attorney, not through a legal buffer, but directly, face to face, question after question, and the courtroom watched in silence. This wasn't a movie scene. This wasn't a dramatization. This was real life, unfolding under oath. The charges were severe. Prosecutors said the incident happened inside the girl's home while her mother was away. They described a brief but terrifying encounter, one that sent the teen running to a neighbor's house in tears, searching for safety. Now, years later, she was being asked to relive it, this time by the man accused of causing it. Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Why didn't you react the way I think you should have? These were not questions coming from a defense attorney trained in distance and restraint. They were coming from the accused himself. The tension in the room was undeniable. Jurors watched closely. The judge listened carefully. And the teenage witness answered, calmly, directly, with the weight of truth pressing behind every word. She explained that fear doesn't follow a script, that survival doesn't look the same for everyone, that in moments of shock, instinct takes over, and sometimes the only thought is to make it stop. Outside the courtroom, people would later ask, how was this allowed? Should it have been stopped? And what does justice look like when the legal system permits something so confronting? Because this case wasn't just about what allegedly happened in a bedroom. It became about power, about control, and about whether the courtroom itself can become another battleground. As DNA evidence loomed and prosecutors prepared to close in, the strategy of self-defense, both legal and personal, would ultimately be tested. What the jury decided next would end one story and begin another. This is the true story of a courtroom confrontation that shocked everyone who witnessed it. A case that forced jurors to look beyond emotion and focus on evidence. And a reminder that sometimes the most unsettling moments of justice don't happen in the dark, but under bright lights, with everyone watching. Stay with us, because what happened next would decide everything. Welcome to LAT True Crime Stories. I am your host. Today we are breaking down one of the most twisted cases you've ever seen. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button, smash the like button, and leave your comment to tell us where you're watching from. Let's build this community together. Now let's get into it. Every case begins long before it reaches a courtroom, long before jurors take their seats, long before a judge calls the room to order, and long before a teenager is asked to recount moments no one her age should ever have to explain. To understand how this case arrived at such a shocking courtroom moment, you have to go back to the relationship dynamics that framed everything that followed. At the center of this case was Rico Johnson, a man who had been in a relationship with the mother of the teenage girl who would later accuse him. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't an unknown figure passing through. He was someone familiar, someone who had access to the home, to the routine, to the private spaces where people are supposed to feel safe. That familiarity would later become one of the most troubling elements of the prosecution's case. According to investigators, the incident occurred in April 2019, inside the family home. The girl was 15 years old at the time. Her mother was not there. What should have been an ordinary day, quiet and uneventful, would instead become a moment that altered the course of her life. Prosecutors would later say the encounter was brief, only a few minutes, but made devastating by the circumstances. The allegation was not just about an act, but about the violation of trust, the sudden loss of safety, and the confusion that follows when danger comes from someone known. When the encounter ended, the girl did not remain in the house. She ran. Investigators say she fled to a neighbor's home, visibly distressed, searching for help. It was there, away from the place where she no longer felt safe, that the first alarm was raised. Law enforcement became involved. Statements were taken. The situation moved quickly from a private family matter into a criminal investigation. From the beginning, the stakes were high. Johnson was charged with serious felony offenses, including sexual battery involving a minor. These were not accusations that could be explained away as misunderstandings or minor disputes. If proven, they carried the potential for severe consequences and long-term imprisonment. As the case moved forward, prosecutors began assembling evidence they believed would support the girl's account. This included forensic testing, witness testimony, and a timeline meant to show opportunity and access. But from the other side, Johnson maintained his innocence. He did not quietly rely on an attorney to speak for him. Instead, he made a decision that would shape the entire trial and ultimately define how the public would remember it. He chose to represent himself. In the American legal system, defendants have the constitutional right to act as their own attorney. Judges typically warn them of the risks. The law is complex, courtroom procedure is unforgiving, and emotional involvement can cloud judgment. Johnson acknowledged those warnings and proceeded anyway. From that moment on, the trial became something more than a standard criminal proceeding. It became a test of boundaries. As opening statements approached, observers noted Johnson's confidence. He spoke directly to the jury, attempting to frame himself not as a predator, but as a man wrongfully accused. He suggested inconsistencies. He questioned motives, and he positioned himself as someone fighting for his freedom against what he claimed were false allegations. Meanwhile, the teenage victim prepared to testify. For a young person, testifying in open court is never easy. Doing so against someone once close to the family adds another layer of emotional strain. Doing so while knowing that the accused will personally question you takes that strain to an entirely different level. Yet, when the moment came, she took the stand. Her testimony was calm, measured, direct. She told the jury what she said happened that day. She explained where she was, where Johnson was, and how quickly the situation escalated. She described fear, confusion, and the instinct to escape rather than analyze or plan. This was not a performance. It was an account. And then came the moment no one in the courtroom could ignore. The judge looked to the defense table, and Rico Johnson stood up.
From the start to finish, you will be able to see through the lies being told about me.
Johnson, who is defending himself, is accused of raping his ex-girlfriend's 15-year-old daughter. Prosecutors say 2 years ago, Johnson attacked the teenager in her bedroom while her mother was at work.
She began to push him off as he's pulling her dress up. She begins to pull it down.
The girl, who we are not identifying because of the nature of the charges, told a jury about it.
But the rape lasted around 3 or 4 minutes.
But things got even more uncomfortable and awkward when her accused rapist began questioning her on the stand.
Can you explain more details?
I was crying to her and tell her how you just raped me.
The cringeworthy cross-examination went on for nearly an hour, and it only got worse for Johnson.
You said I came in your room and you had your phone in your hand. Do you have any opportunity at any time to call the police?
No, I was too busy telling you to stop and pushing your hand off me.
Months ago, a Tampa judge warned Johnson he was in over his head, yet he didn't want to hear it.
You're not in a good position to represent yourself.
Hell no, but it's my life. Nobody ain't defending me the way, no type of way.
But is Johnson's way backfiring with the jury? He will know soon. Gloria Gomez, Fox 13 News.
Not to object, not to consult counsel, but to begin asking questions himself. This was the point where the trial shifted from a case about allegations to a confrontation unfolding in real time. What followed would last nearly an hour, and it would leave jurors, legal observers, and the public asking the same question. Just because something is legally allowed, does that make it just? By the time Rico Johnson rose from the defense table, the courtroom had already absorbed the gravity of the allegations. The jury had heard the background. They had listened to the teenage witness describe what she said happened inside the home. The atmosphere was tense, but controlled. That control began to fray the moment Johnson began asking questions. There was no legal intermediary, no practiced distance, just the accused and the witness, separated by a few feet, and the authority of the court. Johnson's strategy became clear almost immediately. He did not focus on timelines or locations at first. Instead, he centered his questions on behavior, what the teenager did, what she didn't do, and why her reactions didn't align with what he suggested were expected responses. His approach followed a familiar defense pattern. If the reactions can be questioned, then perhaps the account itself can be cast into doubt. Why didn't you call for help sooner? Why didn't you contact your mother immediately? Why didn't you record anything? Each question was delivered deliberately, sometimes repetitively, as though persistence alone could force a contradiction. But the witness did not take the bait. She explained, calmly and consistently, that fear does not come with instructions, that in moments of shock, there is no checklist, only the instinct to escape. She told the jury she was focused on getting away, on making it stop, on finding safety wherever she could. Her answers were brief, controlled, unemotional. That restraint mattered, because as the cross-examination continued, something became increasingly clear to the people watching. The teenager was not unraveling. She was holding her ground. The judge allowed the questioning to continue, intervening only to maintain order or redirect when questions drifted into irrelevance. Jurors leaned forward. Some took notes. Others watched without writing, absorbing the exchange in silence. Nearly an hour passed, and when Johnson finally sat down, the room exhaled. But the trial was far from over. The prosecution now stepped back into focus, not with emotion, but with structure. This was where the investigation began to take center stage. Prosecutors laid out the timeline with precision. They revisited the day in question, narrowing the window in which the alleged incident could have occurred. They emphasized opportunity and access, Johnson's presence in the home, the absence of the girl's mother, and the lack of other witnesses in the immediate moment. Then came the evidence designed to corroborate the account. Investigators testified about the response after the girl fled the house. They described her arrival at a neighbor's home and her emotional state at the time. This wasn't about dramatization. It was about consistency, whether her reactions aligned across statements, across time, across different audiences. They did. The prosecution also turned to forensic testing. While avoiding unnecessary detail, they made one critical point clear to the jury. DNA analysis had been conducted, and the results were not favorable to Johnson's defense. Prosecutors argued that the scientific evidence supported the account given by the teenage witness and placed Johnson at the center of the incident in a way that testimony alone could not. Science, they reminded the jury, does not rely on memory or emotion. It relies on data. As this evidence was introduced, the defense strategy shifted. Johnson began objecting more frequently. He challenged procedures. He questioned the credibility of the testing. He suggested alternative explanations without offering concrete proof. But the more he spoke, the clearer the contrast became. On one side was a structured narrative backed by timelines, witness accounts, and forensic results. On the other was a defense rooted primarily in doubt, asking jurors not to believe what they had heard, without offering a fully formed alternative explanation. The prosecution seized that contrast. They reminded the jury that this was not a case built on speculation. It was built on convergence, multiple elements pointing in the same direction. The girl's immediate flight, her consistent statements, the physical evidence, the absence of any credible motive for fabrication. As the state rested its case, the room felt heavier than before, because by now, the jury had seen both sides up close. They had watched an accused man confront his accuser directly. They had listened to a teenager answer questions no one should have to face from someone she accused of harming her. And they had reviewed evidence that extended beyond words. The question looming over the courtroom was no longer just what happened. It was whether the defense's approach, bold, confrontational, and unconventional, had helped Johnson or quietly undermined him. As the trial moved toward closing arguments, one truth stood out. The confrontation had already happened. Now judgment was coming. By the time closing arguments began, the courtroom felt smaller than it had days before. Not because the walls had moved, but because every possible explanation had been tested. The jury had heard the testimony. They had watched the confrontation unfold. They had examined the evidence piece by piece. Now, they were being asked to decide what it all meant. The prosecution went first. Their message was deliberate and restrained. This case, they told the jury, was not about courtroom theatrics. It was not about who spoke longer, or louder, or more confidently. It was about credibility, consistency, and corroboration. They reminded jurors of the timeline, of the girl's immediate flight from the home, of the neighbor who provided help, of the statements that never changed, even under pressure. And they returned, again, to the science. Forensic evidence, they said, does not adjust its story based on who is asking the questions. It does not bend under stress. It either aligns with the truth, or it does not. In this case, the prosecution argued it aligned. They acknowledged the emotional difficulty of the trial. They acknowledged the discomfort many jurors likely felt watching a teenager questioned directly by the man she accused. But they urged the jury to separate discomfort from decision-making. Justice, they said, requires clarity. Then it was Rico Johnson's turn. Standing alone at the defense table, he spoke directly to the jury, without legal polish, without professional distance. He claimed he was the one being wronged. He questioned the credibility of the accusation and suggested that the situation had been misunderstood, exaggerated, or misrepresented. But what Johnson did not provide was a cohesive alternative explanation, supported by evidence. There were no witnesses to contradict the timeline, no forensic results to counter the state's findings, no credible motive established for fabrication. As his closing argument ended, the room fell silent. The jury was sent out to deliberate, and for the first time in days, the courtroom was quiet, not tense with testimony, but heavy with anticipation. No one knew how long the jury would take. Minutes stretched into hours. Then, finally, the jurors returned. They filed into their seats, faces composed, verdict forms in hand. The judge asked the foreperson to stand. The question was asked, and the answer came back, clear and decisive. Guilty on all counts. The words echoed through the courtroom, final and irreversible. For the teenage victim, the moment was not celebratory. There was no visible relief, only the weight of an ordeal reaching its end. Justice does not erase trauma. It does not restore what was taken, but it can offer validation. It can say, "You were heard." For Johnson, the strategy he had chosen, representing himself, confronting his accuser, rejecting counsel, had failed. The jury was unconvinced. The evidence, taken as a whole, was stronger than doubt. He was taken into custody to await sentencing. In the weeks that followed, the case drew attention not just for its verdict, but for what it revealed about the justice system itself. Legal experts debated the boundaries of self-representation. While the right exists to protect fairness, cases like this raise difficult questions. Should there be limits when vulnerable witnesses are involved? Can a courtroom remain neutral when power dynamics are so visibly uneven? Victim advocacy groups pointed to the emotional cost of direct confrontation. They emphasized that while the legal system must protect the rights of the accused, it must also ensure that those who testify, especially minors, are not re-traumatized in the process. The case became a reference point, not because it was the first of its kind, but because it made the consequences visible. At sentencing, the court considered the seriousness of the crimes, the age of the victim, and the impact statements presented. Johnson faced a lengthy prison sentence, one that would define the rest of his life. For the teenager and her family, the future would look different. Healing would take time. Normalcy would not return overnight. But the trial was over. The confrontation had ended, and the system, imperfect as it may be, had reached a conclusion. This story does not end with closure. It ends with reflection, because this case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, power, and resilience. It reminds us that truth does not always arrive with drama, but with consistency. That courage does not always shout, but often answers quietly, again and again, under pressure. It also reminds us that the courtroom is not just a place for rules and procedures. It is a place where real lives intersect with the law, where decisions carry consequences far beyond the verdict form. And for viewers watching the story unfold, the questions linger. Should defendants be allowed to personally question their accusers in cases involving minors? Does legal fairness require emotional distance or absolute freedom? And how do we balance rights without causing further harm? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones. If this story made you think, if it challenged your understanding of justice, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Respectful discussion matters. Awareness matters. And telling these stories responsibly matters. If you found this breakdown informative, consider subscribing for more true crime stories that focus on facts, context, and the human impact behind the headlines. Because behind every case file is a real person. And behind every verdict is a story worth understanding.